Good morning to our audience in LA, Vancouver, Greece, and the world over. My name is Dimitris Krallis, and I'm professor of Byzantine history at Simon Fraser University's Department of Humanities and director of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies at our institution, the sister program to UCLA's SNF Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture, which is presided by my wonderful colleague and fellow Byzantinist, Professor Sharon Gestel. It is the generosity of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation that over the years made these and many other of our events possible. This event in particular is the second in a series of events that are part of a long-term collaboration between our two centers that aims to more efficiently harness our combined resources for the benefit of our students and the communities we serve in LA, Vancouver, and the world over. On this 200th anniversary since the beginning of the Greek War of Independence, as we celebrate that seminal moment when we can, in a way, date the beginning of the Age of Nations, it is more than appropriate that two Hellenic studies centers far from Greece, nestled within vibrant communities of diaspora Greeks, are carrying the torch down the path of memory. For it was among diaspora Greeks that 200 years ago, the planning and organization for what was to become a Greek event took place, reminding us that whatever the distances involved, Hellenism has since antiquity been a distributed phenomenon, anchored to be sure in Greece, but strengthened by and constantly renewed through its relationships with its far-flung diasporic branches. In order to emphasize this vital link between the diaspora and metropolitan Greece, my colleagues at UCLA and our team in Vancouver sought from the first moment to engage Greece's diplomatic representatives in our respective countries, the US and Canada. This event is therefore organized under the auspices of the Greek embassies in the US and Canada and has benefited from the support of our consular authorities in LA and Vancouver as well. I would therefore like to thank and acknowledge their excellencies, Ambassador Alexandra Papadopoulou, the Consul General of Greece in LA, Evgenia Beniatoglou, and the Consul General of Greece in Vancouver, Eleni Georgopoulou, before I introduce you to the Ambassador of Greece to Canada, Her Excellency Konstantina Athanasiadou. Ambassador Athanasiadou holds a degree in philosophy, classical studies, linguistics, and French literature from the Faculty of Philosophy of the University of Athens, and a degree in medieval and modern Greek studies and history from the Faculty of Philosophy at Ioannina University. She has had a storied career at the Foreign Ministry, a career which has taken her from Moscow to London and Alexandria, and from the offices of the EU in Brussels to the WTO in Geneva and the United Nations in New York. She has also held key posts at the Foreign Ministry, including that of Chief of Protocol and head of the Deputy Foreign Minister Diplomatic Cabinet. She has been serving in Canada since the fall of 2020. Ambassador Athanasiadou is a Grand Commander of the Order of the Phoenix of the Hellenic Republic and is particularly honored to also bear the St. Mark Cross of the Patriarchate of Alexandria and Horn of Africa. She speaks English, French, Spanish, and Russian. So, without further ado, Ambassador, to you.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, it was, your presentation was amazing. I would like to congratulate the center, actually both centers, for presenting today's event. You know that the Embassy of Greece will be always supportive to such event, and I hope that we will have a good cooperation in the future as well. The chapter concerning fighters and women, fighters and victims, women's lives during the Greek Revolution, which is very important since we are celebrating the 200 years of independence, is a chapter which for me had, I do not have an in-depth knowledge of this. So I will really be interested today to follow the presentation by such a renowned professor, Dr. Tsugarakis, and perhaps I will avail myself of small comments or a question at the end. I wanted to tell you that I have a high esteem for the program of the center and also the Center of the United States, and that I am really good, looking forward this year to present more events under the umbrella of the 200 years of independence. Perhaps on other topics on the background of the revolution, meaning, for instance, the diplomatic background, historic events, the outcomes in the different levels of the progress of the revolution until the creation of the modern Greek state. So without taking more time, I wish you all the best. I'm sure it will be a very successful event. I'm very happy to have met you, all of you, at this stage, and I'm really looking forward to meeting you in person in the very near future. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your support and your kind words, and I can assure you that we will find occasion to have you in Vancouver, host you, and share our experiences. And hopefully, if we time it well, we might also have Sharon over for the November event we're planning, on which there will be more information. So with that in mind, we're moving on, and it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague at UCLA, Dr. Simos Zenios, Associate Director of UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture, who will moderate our discussion and introduce our speaker today. Simos received his PhD in comparative literature at Harvard University, and since 2018 has taught Greek language and literature at UCLA. His research focuses on the relationship between aesthetics and political power in the European long 19th century, with emphasis on the literature of the Greek Revolution. His publications cover a broad range of topics and figures: European Philhellenism, Enlightenment theories of rhetoric, and Adamantios Korais, Dionysios Solomos, and Greek modernism. So, welcome, Sino, to you.
It is with great pleasure that I have the opportunity to introduce to you today Eleni Angelomati Tsoungarakis, Professor Emerita at the Ionian University. Eleni studied history and archaeology at the University of Athens, and she holds a PhD in modern history from the University of Oxford. She was a research director at the Research Center for Medieval and Modern Greek Studies of the Academy of Athens. Following that, she held the position of Professor of History at the Ionian University for 15 years. Her interests cover a wide range of subjects: social history, history of intellectual life and education, church history, landscape history, and travel literature as a source for historical knowledge. Before I present her own contributions to scholarship, I want to highlight her impact in collaborative projects. As a director of the MA program Methodology on Criticism and Editing Historical Sources at the Ionian University, she oversaw the editing of and the commentary on numerous historical sources from all periods of early modern Greek and modern Greek history. Several of these sources have been published by the Ionian University Press. Their own publications cover various topics of Greek history from the 15th to the 19th century. We will need a separate meeting devoted to her work in order to do justice both to the range and to the depth of it. Over 70 papers in academic journals and edited volumes, 7 monographs, and a further 7 edited volumes. I will highlight only 2 of her monographs: The Ionian Academy, the chronicle of the foundation of the first Greek university, which has enriched our understanding of the intellectual life of the Ionian Islands, and The Eve of the Greek Revival, British travelers' perceptions of early 19th century Greece, which is foundational in studies of Philhellenism, and I can attest to that personally. Her forthcoming book will examine the role of women in the Greek Revolution. We will have a chance today for a sneak preview from that work with the lecture, Fighters and Victims, Women's Lives During the Greek Revolution. Eleni, the floor is yours.
Hello to everybody. I must thank firstly Your Excellencies, the Ambassador of Greece to the USA, Alexander Papadopoulou, the Ambassador of Greece to Canada, Konstantinos Athanasiadou, the Consul General of Greece in Los Angeles, Mrs. Evgenia Beniatoglou, the Consul General of Greece in Vancouver, Mrs. Ellen Georgopoulou. It is an honor and a privilege for me to be invited to speak at this important occasion that celebrates the bicentenary of the Greek Revolution, which is under their aegis. I'm also particularly indebted to the two Stavros Niarchos Foundation centers at UCLA and at Simon Fraser University for the invitation and the organization of this event. Thank you all. Now, a very, perhaps not tiresome for you, but it is really a very brief view you will have of the role of the women in the Greek Revolution. Greek women's lives are not very well documented. Official documents referring to the Greek Revolution are not very well documented. Official documents referring to them are comparatively few. Letters, memoirs, histories offer us fragmentary, partial, and very often subjective and second-hand information. The revolution affected the Greeks of various places differently and for a different length of time. Women and children were equally affected, though in different ways and in varying degrees. Their lives, hard as they might have been previously, were usually overturned because distraction, loss of lives, enslavement, unbearable human suffering, and mass refugee movements prevailed. Greek women lived and functioned in the private sector. Married women of the higher ranks of society usually had a rather comfortable and sheltered life, supervising the running of their household and the raising of their children. But they were seldom seen in public, although occasionally they might have had some activity in economic affairs. It was only the widows who, as head of their families, were legally more liberated and thus much more active in all social and economic life. Young girls were totally secluded until marriage. Marriage was a social obligation for the family and for both sexes. Not getting married and having children was also considered detrimental to the Greeks for demographical reasons, as an ecumenical patriarch had pronounced in the middle of the 18th century. Early betrothals were customary, so were marriages at very young age. The legal marriage age was 12 for the girls and 14 for the boys. Despite that, more men married much later in life, causing the disapproval of the aforementioned patriarch. Dowries were essential for marriages, and families were obliged to provide them. Lower-class women had very hard lives. In rural areas, they worked along with the other family members as unpaid laborers or as hired agricultural laborers since very young age. They took care of all household duties and of raising their children. Yes, they took care of the household duties and of raising their children or their young siblings. In the towns, poor girls worked usually as servants, married women as wet nurses. On the islands and in mountainous areas, only women and elderly people carried out the agriculture and all other kinds of work, since most men were absent from their homes for long periods of time, working as sailors, carriers, traders, artisans, etc. Additionally, every stage of the production of clothing for the entire family was done by women. On some islands and in mountainous villages, there were also small or medium-scale private enterprises run by women, mostly in making cloth, stockings, gloves, and caps, handkerchiefs, and various other things such as sails and ropes. Education for girls was non-existent except for those who belonged to families of scholars or to the higher ranks of society, like the Phanariot ladies. Contrary to this rather dismal picture, Greek women had more legal rights than most European women. Not all the present-day Greece was then under the Ottomans. On the other hand, A very large Greek population lived all over the Ottoman Empire outside of Greece. So the revolution directly or indirectly affected them as well. The Ionian Islands were then a British protectorate, the Ionian state, and the Ionian Greeks were its citizens. As a great number of, of Ionian men left to join the revolution, and the Ionian merchant navy helped transporting men, food, and ammunition to the fighting Greeks, the British imposed a very strict neutrality, stipulating severe punishment for offenders. Moreover, the Ionians were also affected by the influx of refugees from mainland Greece, whom they tried to help and support. The consequences of the war were very severe on all the Aegean islands. Some were totally destroyed. Cyprus and Crete suffered a great deal, and many of their inhabitants migrated to Greece. Other islands suffered for various reasons and for varying degrees from the expedition of the Ottoman Navy, the results of the battles in their vicinity, occasional pirate attacks, internal strifes between the Orthodox and Catholic communities, etc. Many of them faced a very serious refugee problem. People from Asia Minor, Crete, other Aegean islands, and mainland Greece sought shelter there. Often the refugees were much greater in number than the local population of some small islands, which could hardly support them, barren and poor as they were, and with their commerce seriously or completely disrupted. Only in few of the small but rich islands, everyday life continued without many dramatic changes. Since the revolution did not break out everywhere at the same time, the first changes in women's lives started being felt gradually. When the news of the revolution in the Danubian principalities, as you see them there, became known, some of the distinguished Phanerot Greek families escaped from Constantinople to Russia just in time. Then, some managed to get out of Constantinople later, but when the Sultan's order and the executions of the most important Phanerot officials and the patriarchs started, while the mob indiscriminately killed the Greeks of the city, the Greek noble ladies were difficult to get shelter anywhere. Some of them managed to escape secretly on board Greek ships under the Russian flag, helped by the Russian consul. Others were exiled along with their children to various towns of Asia Minor, while some others were kept imprisoned in their own houses. On the eve of the Greek revival, of the Greek Revolution in the Peloponnese, and immediately after, many local political leaders, chieftains, and some merchants moved their families to safer places like the fortified monastery of Megaspilion in Calavrita and the castle of Klomouchi in western Peloponnese. Then all of these and many others were transferred to the Ionian Islands, where the men used to have commercial interests before, and some chieftains, for example Kolokotronis, had lived there not long ago. As the war progressed, the number of refugee women and children in the Ionian Island increased, but they were not just from the Morea, but also from the western Greece and Pyrrhus. By mid-May 1821, 7,000 women and children had moved just to Zante. The refugee numbers increased for as long as the Brits allowed it, which was not always the case. Eventually, the small Ionian islands of Kalamos became officially a place where civilian refugees, women and children, and some elderly people were allowed to stay. At some point, their numbers there reached 15,000. Many more refugees resided in the main Ionian Islands and were supported by the local inhabitants. Thrace, Macedonia, and Thessaly joined the revolution in May 1821. They were in greater disadvantage than southern Greece because of the greater number of Turks and their army there. They went through very hard times and suffered substantial losses of their population due to the warfare, combined with large-scale massacres, enslavement, and the general flight of the Greeks to safer regions. Arranging for women and children to move before the war reached their homes was not at all easy. Several Greek sources vividly describe what usually happened in most places. When the Turks or later the Egyptian forces approached the villages, panic-stricken women and children fled in a disorderly fashion and in an often futile attempt to search for shelter up on the mountains, in caves, and on precipitous heights. In the Morea, there were one or two places where very tall removable ladders had been made, which women used in order to climb up to very dangerous heights and hide in unapproachable caves. Often, rather than being captured, young girls and women holding their children committed suicide by throwing themselves off cliffs. Sometimes they managed to drag the enemy soldiers, holding them down with them. If they were pursued somewhere near the sea, a lake, or a river, they chose to jump in and drown. When they were on higher ground at the top of precipitous slopes, they dropped rocks and stones and whatever else was available on their pursuers, often managing to kill them. In towns and cities, however, there were foreign consulates where women and children turned to for shelter. In several cases, the foreign consuls helped and protected them. In some others, they closed their doors to them. Foreign eyewitnesses described the courtyards of many European embassies in Constantinople as being so full of Greek people that their residents could hardly enter the mansions without stepping on them. The French consuls in Smyrna and in Patras rescued many Greek families. In contrast, the Turcophile British consul in Patras as well sent the terrified women and children seeking shelter in his consulate away. Large and small-scale massacres generally followed this pattern. Men, older women, and babies were killed on the spot, and younger women, girls, and young boys were taken prisoners. In most cases, we don't know the exact numbers either of the dead or of the prisoners. The prisoners were sent to be sold in slave markets all over the Ottoman Empire and in northern Africa. Women generally believed that to become a slave was a worse fate than death, and that's why they preferred to take their own lives and the lives of their children rather than being taken prisoners. Moreover, a quick death was always preferable to death by torture, which happened in some cases when women prisoners refused to convert to Islam. That was the fate of the wives of some leaders of the revolution in Naousa in 1822. When they refused to convert, they were tortured to death in Thessaloniki. Having to choose between slavery, conversion, or death, 13 young girls of Naousa chose death and threw themselves down the falls of the river. Women and children were driven from various places of Macedonia to Thessaloniki in a series of caravans to be sold in the slave market there. This scene is described by the French consul of that city who witnessed it on May the 10th, 1822. Desperate women and children of Macedonia trespassed into the forbidden grounds of Mount Athos, the holy mountain, seeking shelter there. That was the first time ever that women entered the Agion Oros in its 1,000-year history of exclusively male monastic communities. The most tragic of all massacres was perhaps that of Chios, which shocked alike the Greeks and the people of Europe and America. Chios was the most prosperous island of Greece, with a population between 100,000 and 120,000 people. It had thriving commerce with branches in Constantinople, Leghorn, Trieste, and even London. It also had a famous school with an extensive library and a printing press. Between March and July 1822, this island was completely destroyed. In the end, only 1,800 people remained alive there. Of course, some people managed to flee, and many other merchants in particular were absent at the time. According to various estimates, approximately 20,000 people were saved. Those slaughtered were said to have been between 30,000 and 42,000. Those who were taken as slaves were estimated to be between 47 and 61,000, nearly all of them women and children. According to the British Consul General at Smyrna, Francis Wherry, 45,000 women and children were taken alive and then sold as slaves. Some of them were later ransomed by their rich relatives. We have several chilling eyewitness accounts of the massacres, rapes, torture, and the fate of those taken prisoners. Sorry, I don't know why. Here we are, yeah. Among those prisoners who escaped were a few young boys who, after several adventures, were helped by American missionaries and volunteers to go to the United States. One of them, the one you see on the picture there, Christophorus Plato Castanis, who eventually became a scholar, published his account of the tragic events in 1851 in the States. There are also several other published accounts by Greeks who survived that ordeal. Reverend Robert Walsh, the chaplain of the British Embassy at Constantinople at that time, gives us some of the most detailed descriptions of the fate of those slaves there. I will read to you a short passage of his account of just one of the several slave markets. It is as good as any picture. The first exposure, he writes, was a number of poor girls of the age of 12 or 14 who were sold like cattle at the English fair. Several of them were without trousers or the necessary articles of dress. Terror and anxiety had so affected them that they exhibited the most deplorable picture of human suffering I ever beheld, and such as cannot be described. They were taken and huddled with the roughness of butchers examining young cattle, and generally sold at the rate of 100 piastres or 3 pounds per head. 500 were disposed of in this way from here. Walsh obviously thought that some of his English readers believed that the Greek women were easily reconciled to being a harem, and so he adds, I quote, "The horror and repugnance felt by the freeborn Greek women to slavery among the Turks under any modification is invincible, and they infinitely prefer death." Walsh noticed early on something which is also mentioned by various others later. That is, that enslaved young girls and women were so ashamed after being so degraded that they felt, and I quote, that they were not worth redeeming, since they could only bring disgrace to their families too. So they refused to be ransomed. The Greek boys had an equally terrible fate. Many were compelled to convert. Every day, circumcision would be performed to about 50 boys at the same time in Constantinople, and the boys' mourning could be heard afterwards by passers-by of these houses where groups of them were left to recover. If any of the boys later reverted to Christianity, they would be immediately put to death. Other misfortunes fell upon those who refused conversion to Islam. Some were sent to serve in famous public places akin to brothels, and others were publicly exposed in coffee houses and in hunts. One of Walsh's friends told him that in one such hunt, a boy had asked him to kill him to save him from his misery. Similar things happened to women and children in all slave markets. We have even more horrible accounts by women who were eventually ransomed or managed to escape. For example, a girl described that she was sold 40 times within the same day. Another killed herself to avoid marrying the Turk who had bought her, but her sister, whose hand had been cut off then, was ransomed. All this became widely known to the peoples of Europe and the United States through books and newspapers and helped boost the Phil-Hellenic movement. Less well known, but with the same tragic results, was another massacre that took place in June 1821. The town of Kydonis, the present-day Ivali, was completely destroyed. Kydonis was a flourishing town on the coast of Asia Minor, just across from Lesbos. It was a self-governed, completely Greek town with a very important Greek school and a population of about 30,000 people. This town was burnt to the ground. A considerable number of the population and Greeks of the nearby villages were saved by the Greek navy. However, many others were killed or drowned, and the rest, women and children, were taken as slaves. Francis Ware again wrote for Smyrna that in a town 35 miles away, there was a slave market where thousands of Greek women from Kydonis were sold. Others were also being sold at various cities of Asia Minor. In 1824, two major disasters took place, both on Aegean Islands. At the end of May of that year, 45 Egyptian ships arrived at the island of Khasos and the Dodecanese. The subsequent pillage, massacre, and enslavement of women left the island desolate. Egyptian ships took 2,000 women to Alexandria where they were sold. Less than a month later, another major catastrophe took place and left the island of Psara in the North Aegean also completely desolate. Although small, Psara was the third strongest naval power in Greece. This new total destruction moved the people of Europe and America as much as the destruction of Chios did. About half of the 7,000 population of Psara escaped in their ships, but most of the women of the island were captured, although some of them were ransomed later. Even the consul of Russia was killed along with women and children who he tried to protect. Several women with their children jumped into the sea to avoid capture and drowned. Others died when the defenders of the fortress detonated the ammunition depot as soon as the Turks got there. Some other women who had tried to escape in rowing boats were killed. What happened to Missolonghi truly shook not only the Greeks, but all the Christian world at the time. The town had become quite well known because of Lord Byron's death there and the numerous references to it in books and newspapers. The long third siege of Missolonghi lasted, with small intervals, for about a year between 1825 and 26. The life of the besieged population during that time was as tragic as the outcome of their exodus was. A rather small number of women and children had initially been sent to the Ionian Islands, not just for safety, but also in order to save on the limited food supplies during the siege. The majority of women, however, remained in the town, and they actively helped in the construction of new bastions and the repairing of the walls that were damaged on a daily basis by shell fire of the enemies. When the Greek navy failed to relieve the long siege, the population inside the town had reached the point of starvation. The fighters decided to attempt an organized exit, whatever the cost might be, rather than surrender. Initially, it was suggested that they should kill all the women and children because the sortie would be more dangerous with them and it was probably impossible for them to survive anyway. However, it was not unusual for men to kill their wives and children rather than to let them fall into the hands of the enemy, as women also used to do. But the local bishop strongly, very strongly refuted and rejected all these ideas. So it was decided, finally, that the sick, the wounded, and the elderly, and anyone who didn't wish to, would remain in the town and try to delay the enemy. The women and their children would follow the fighters, who would exit in 3 separate columns. Many women were dressed in men's clothing since they preferred to be taken for men during the battle and be killed rather than be taken alive. For this reason, cross-dressing was not very uncommon for women if they were in a camp with the troops or they were traveling alone. However, the sortie, the Exodus as it became known, on the night of the 22nd of April 1826 was a disaster because the plan had become known to the enemy. That's the gate of the Exodus that survives. Most of the Solagi garrison was killed, and from the women, just 13 survived, whereas others turned back to the town to save themselves. When the Egyptians entered Missolonghi, the bishop and many of the remaining Greeks blew themselves up with the stored gunpowder. The rest were killed and the women were taken as slaves. The exact number of women killed and or enslaved is once again not known. Foreign sources estimated that those who were taken as slaves were between 5,000 and 6,000. The fate of the captives had been described by various foreign authors. A number of them actually saw some of these women in the slave market of Methoni, a town of southeastern Morea, and in Ibrahim Pasha's camp. The women were first examined by doctors to establish whether they were virgins or not and whether they had any disease. Then Ibrahim chose the prettiest, kept the ones he liked himself, and the rest were given as gifts to his officials. Afterwards, many women and children were sold in slave markets in Egypt and in North African countries. A young virgin could fetch 1,500 piastres at the time. Slaves could be ransomed, but it was a long and complicated process. In the first place, if they had been sold in a slave market, it was difficult to locate where they were and to whom they had been sold. In the case of several successive sales, the task was even more difficult. It was a little easier when they were held by an official or someone who had intended to secure ransoms or to make an exchange with prisoners held by the Greeks. However, the ransoms demanded were usually much higher than the selling price in the slave markets, so it was nearly impossible for the majority of the families to ransom their relatives. Rich merchants from Chios were able to do that. We know the financial details of the ransoms paid by Theodore Rallis for his wife and 2 young daughters. He paid altogether 13,900 piastres. That was a fortune. The Greek government did not have the means to help much. In July 1824, the men of Psara petitioned the Greek parliament for money to ransom their womenfolk and children. Their petition was accepted, but only 10,000 piastres were provided to be shared between them when the ransom asked for just the wife and child of one of the captains was exactly that sum. A native of Psara, Ioannis Varvakis, a very rich Greek immigrant in Russia, helped in ransoming many women of that island. Sometimes Even when the money was available, it took a very long time for the slaves to be freed by their masters or by those supposedly friendly Turks to whom women and children had been entrusted to protect them. That was the case of the family of a very well-known fighter, Kasumoulis. The so-called protector of members of his family in Thessaloniki demanded 25,000 piastres to let them go. 7 years later, his mother was released. His two sisters were set free sometimes in 1831. Greeks from various places kept on trying to find and ransom their lost relatives until 1837, as we know from their applications to the Greek government listing the names of their missing relatives. After the fall of Missolonghi, the Philhellene Swiss banker Jean-Gabriel Eynac and the Greek committee of Zante ransomed several of the women of the town. These poor women, like so many others in similar situations, had nowhere to go. They had lost their families and means of subsistence. A number of them remained at first at the refugee camp of Kalamos. Others were settled at Nafplion, the capital of Greece. But it was a small town, lacking both accommodation and the proper hygienic conditions to accommodate the great number of refugee population from all over Greece. Many families lived in extremely bad conditions, sometimes in nearby caves or in self-made huts like the one you can discern here. And lack of food was perhaps the most serious of their problem. It is known that some women and children died from starvation. Clothing was a scarcity as well. Many of these destitute women, however, submitted applications to the authorities describing their desperate situation or the services rendered either by their dead relatives or themselves in the war and asked for a small pension. The government usually did give them one, but it lacked the means to offer a substantial help. Private American aid in 1827 greatly helped to feed and clothe the starving and half-naked Greek population of the Morea and of nearby islands, which were full of refugees. It should be made clear that the insufficient food was quite common for all Greeks due to that great reduction of agricultural production. The war often prevented any proper cultivation of the land and or the collection of the harvests, which were often taken by the enemy itself. From the early years of the revolution, the islands of Salamina and Aegina were where Athenian women mainly sought shelter, and so did women from nearby regions. During the two sieges of the Acropolis of Athens, first in 1822 and then in 1826 to 27, most Athenian women and children were transported to these islands for safety. Their move left the men fighting without having to concern themselves about them and saved on the food supplies of the besieged. George Waddington, the Dean of Durham, a traveler at the time, attempted a kind of census with the help of the Greek clergy and the Austrian Council of Athens in 1824. Of the 11,500 people living in Salamina that year, the locals were just 192, although by then most Athenians were already back in Athens, where more refugees had gathered from elsewhere. During the lengthy second siege of the Acropolis, and as the war continued in Attica, the Athenian women and children, once more refugees in Salamina, were living in such bad conditions that the acting bishop of Athens asked the inhabitants of Aegina to come to help them. The news became widely known and fundraising began for the support that started among other Greeks as well. Soon over 3,000 piastres were collected. Women and children also suffered during the second phase of the civil war in the Morea, when troops from Rumeli moved in to help their friendly faction against their opponents. Then, the shortage of food became even worse as irregular soldiers plundered the richer regions of the Morea. Some sources mention that there were attacks on the women as well as rapes, while others claim that rapes were actually rare because of the widespread superstition among the men that those who committed such a crime would be killed in battle. Rapes were extremely rare before the revolution, and they were severely punished those who raped women, particularly if the girl was a virgin. It was not always easy, however, to punish these crimes properly during the war. But at the very least, the man was obliged to marry his victim without any dowry, or alternatively, he would have to pay a very heavy fine as a compensation. Aside from their everyday chores, women also helped in the warfare. We know that they acted as couriers, messengers, and even spies. They carried food and ammunition for the soldiers to their camps. In some cases, in Athens for example, they helped prepare the ammunition the men used. We have already mentioned how they all helped with the reinforcements of the wars during the siege of Thessaloniki. They also fought. They did that to protect themselves during their flights on the mountains, as we have seen. But they also participated in battles, although they did not usually bear arms. There were, of course, exceptions, and certainly some women, like Bubulina, had their own weapons. But commonly, women went into battle carrying all kinds of domestic or farm tools, such, for example, clubs, iron rods, and, in their absence, stones and rocks. At the beginning of the revolution, there were not enough weapons even for the men. So, those who without also had to fight with agricultural tools until they killed the Turk to get his weapons. That's how the women of Mani fought at the siege of Tripolitsa in 1821 and in 1826, when without or with very few arms, when they bravely pushed back the Egyptians of Ibrahim Pasha, who had invaded Mani, and they successfully faced down sieges in their towers. Some women were also carried arms during the exodus from Missolonghi, but that was a special occasion. Only two women in Greece and abroad at the time were very famous, Laskarina Bouboulina and Mandou Mavrogheni. They were depicted on stamps and on Greek coins and banknotes. That was, of course, before the euro. On 30th March 2018, a presidential decree posthumously conferred the honorary rank of Rear Admiral, the Medal of Exceptional Acts, and the First Class War Cross to Bouboulina. It is commonly said that both Bouboulina and Mandou were members of the Φιλική Εταιρεία, the secret society of friends. However, their names are not included in any of the surviving lists of the society members. Only one woman's name appears in those lists, that of one Kyriaki Nafti. She was the wife of a medical doctor practicing in Smyrna, and he was a member of the Φιλική Εταιρεία. When Kyriaki found some of its secret documents that he kept at home, it was agreed by other members of the Etαιρεία to put her under oath and initiate her. Once this was done, Kyriaki paid the very high sum of 3,000 piastres as a contribution to the cause, since donations were obligatory for the new members. Bouboulina and Mandou had very few things in common other than their patriotism and their distinguished and prosperous family background. There are several references to both of them from contemporary Greeks and foreigners alike. Their portraits were published frequently in various publications, but these illustrations were mostly imaginary. Bouboulina was from Hydra and has been described correctly as rather homely and stout. She was middle-aged and a widow after two marriages with wealthy ship owners from Spetses. She had 6 grown-up children, 3 from each of the 2 marriages, but 3 of her sons were killed at the war. Bubulina was called after her second husband's surname, Bubulis, and that's her signature. She was intelligent and capable, and after being widowed, she proved to be a very good manager of the family fortune, which considerably increased. In 1820, she had built a very expensive, very large 18-cannon ship named Agamemnon, which she used as her flagship, while she also had 3 smaller ships. Bubulina was at the siege of Tripolitsa and participated in several naval operations, for example, the blockade of Nafplion and of Monemvasia. Within a few years, she had spent all her fortune on her fleet. She supported Kolokotronis during the Civil War, so she was persecuted as he was. In 1825, she was killed in Spetses during a dispute with a local family. The Greeks admired this manly, as they called, woman, and she was even described as an unusual natural phenomenon. She was very popular in Europe and thus had numerous imaginary portraits you saw. Manteau, short for Madeleine Mavrogianni, daughter of a rich merchant of Mykonos, was young, pretty, and well educated. She spoke Italian and French, and she was dressed in a European fashion. Also, she was single. Curiously enough, we don't have many details about her contribution to the war. There is a certificate written by Dimitris Psylandis stating that during the first 2 years of the revolution, she had funded a corps of 200 men to fight in the Morea. She had also funded 2 expeditions, one for a band of men to go to help Samos and another to go to Chios for the same purpose. But both were made under the cover of male relatives' names because she didn't want to upset her family. In October 1822, leading a band of men, she helped to repel an attack on Mykonos by Algerian pirates. Her participation in an expedition to Charistos is uncertain, but she contributed 2,000 piastres towards its cost. Manteau wrote 2 letters, one to the ladies of England and the other to the ladies of France, to move their sympathies for the Greek cause. The letter to the French ladies was published at the end of the book written about her by Geneviève in 1825. She had a very unhappy love story with Dimitris Psylandis, who broke off their engagement. Then, feeling wronged and perhaps dishonored, she started a futile legal battle against him for breach of promise. She spent all her dowry and she even borrowed money to fund the war. She ended up poor and alone, surviving on a small pension. There were other women who also fought in the war, but they did not become famous outside Greece. Domna Visvisis, the wife of the Thracian captain Antonis Visvisis, was on board his ship along with their 5 children when he was killed during a naval operation in 1822. Immediately after, she took over the command of the ship and the crew of 75 men and continued fighting. She kept on fighting for 2 more years until she ran out of means to support the operation of the ship, which she donated to Hydros Navy. Afterwards, she lived with her children in poverty, petitioning for a small pension to the government. One of her sons, the 11-year-old Themistocles, was sent to study in France by the French Philhellenic Committee, along with a small number of other boys from maritime families. An even less well-known woman who distinguished herself in battles was Stavriana Savena, a 40-year-old widow and mother of 5 children from Mani. She fought bravely with Kyriakoulis Mavromichalsis' corps in Morea and in Roumeli. She took part in the siege of Tripolitsa and in the battles of Baltece, Tricorfa, and Verga. In 1829, she petitioned the Argus National Assembly for a small pension for her participation in the war, which it was confirmed by attached signed certificates of several chieftains. She was given a small pension and lived in great poverty all her long life afterwards. Foreign sources refer at length to a young female fighter and leader of a small band of men in the early years of the revolution. She was Constantina, daughter of Zacharias Barbichiotis, the famous cleft of the Morea, who was killed in 1806 by the Turks. It is curious also that she is not mentioned by her contemporary Greeks. In any case, Edward Blackwell, agent of the Phil-Hellenic Greek community of London, met her and wrote her story, adding that all her claims were verified by the local notable Sinis. Constantina had been wounded twice, first in the winter of 1822 and later in the Battle of Patras. When Blackwell met her, she was recovering at Gastuni, a small town in northwestern Morea. Bouqueville, the well-known traveler and writer, also narrates Constantina's life, but in a romantic and rather fictional way. There were certainly many more anonymous women whose everyday fight for survival and freedom has not been recorded. A brief addition is necessary to acknowledge the contribution of a learned young lady, Evanthea Kairis, who used her writing as a weapon in the war. She was the sister of the scholar Theophilus Kairis, a teacher at the school of Kidonias. Since a very young age, Evanthea corresponded with Corais in Paris, and at his suggestions translated two works on the education of the girls, one of which was published later. Evanthea's letter to the Phil-Hellene ladies abroad was printed anonymously in Hydra in 1825, and it was undersigned by 39 other Greek women. This letter was translated into English and into French in 1826. During the Revolution, people's private lives continued as before to the degree that the exceptional circumstances allowed it. So marriages never stopped, even under very difficult circumstances. According to the traditional custom, arranged marriages were still the norm, and a dowry still necessary. Kolokotronis' adjutant, commonly known as Fotakos, claimed that despite all the hardships and dangers, Greeks kept marrying because they wanted to increase their numbers. At the time, marriages also became a very useful instrument in order to secure alliances or establish reconciliation between the families of the chieftains and all politicians. As a result, many arranged marriages took place for political purposes. I will mention just a few as an example. Kolokotronis arranged the marriage of his elder son Panos to Bouboulinas' daughter Eleni, thus linking his family with one of the most important families of the islands. When Panos was killed in the civil war, Bouboulina married her widowed daughter to Theodorakis Grivas, a Roumelot general, establishing a bond with Roumelot faction. Kolokotronis also arranged the marriage of his second son, Ioannis, nicknamed Genneos for his bravery, to Fotini Javela, sister of the Suliot general Kitsos Javelas. Mavrokordatos brought his sister Ekaterini from Constantinople to give her in marriage to the politician and supporter of the English party, Spiridon Trikoupis. Traditionally, the notable families would intermarry, so would those of the chieftains. But a change to this general custom was introduced during the Revolution. Marriages between chieftains' children and those of notables became common for political purposes. There were also marriages and engagements between Greek girls and foreign men, European Phil-Hellenes, volunteers, and travelers. What was completely a new phenomenon was the marriages between Greek men and converted Muslim women. We don't know the actual extent of this phenomenon, but there have been at least 3 such cases of distinguished persons of the revolution who married Muslim girls who had been baptized. Divorces were not generally uncommon, although during the revolution the new laws introduced early on acquired a more secular character. The church still continued to have not only the responsibility for the spiritual dissolution of the marriage, but in practice also the implementation of all family law, divorces included. These were decided based on Byzantine laws, which remained state laws for about a decade. Women filed for divorces, and you see one here, mostly on the grounds of abandonment, mistreatment and abuse, drunkenness, and for unsocial habits and behavior. Illegal marriages were easily dissolved by the church as they had been previously. The surviving official documents show that it was common for women to claim their rights in matters of dowry, inheritance, misappropriation of their money or property, etc. In war years, the very strict social mores gradually began relaxing and unacceptable behaviors made an appearance. Adultery, however, which was not uncommon in the past, does not figure very highly in the divorce cases. What became rather common was that several chieftains lived openly with their lovers and occasionally took them along on their expeditions. When such behavior, however, became too ostentatious and provocative, like that of the politician Ioannis Koletis, it caused social disapproval, which was expressed in several of the memoirs of his contemporaries. Concubinage, previously unknown among the Greeks of the Ottoman Empire, made its appearance in mainland Greece as well. Even a form of prostitution, more or less organized, something unheard of before in Greece, is described as taking place in Patras near the end of the revolution. Among all these changes, there was only one positive development. That was in 1824, when a school for girls was established on the Acropolis of Athens with the financial contribution and support of 4 monasteries, along with a separate school for boys. 56 Athenian girls were initially enrolled in this school, which was named appropriately in Parthenon. This school didn't last long because of the second siege of the Acropolis of the Turks in 1826. On the island of Syros, too, there was a school for both boys and girls before 1829. It was directed by a German doctor, Christian Ludwig Kork, a member of the American Missionary Society. We have seen how much Greek women and their families suffered. After nearly 10 years of war, only a small part of Greece was officially recognized as an independent state. It took more than a century to reach its present borders. The Greek women's lives gradually changed for the better, but this is also another story to be told at another time. Before closing, can we really say who the victims were and who their fighters? As I see it, amidst all the misery and pain, the losses, the tragedies, and everyday hardship, all women proved to be real fighters. Anonymous and eponymous, they all suffered one way or another, and they fought their own war, trying to survive with dignity along with their children. They fought for their religion, for their honor, and their country with whatever means they had, and for as long as they could. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleni, for an incredibly informative and incredibly rich lecture. I'm sure you will be happy to take some questions from the audience. I would like to remind everyone that if you want to ask a question, you may do so either by using the raise hand icon, which is under the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, or you can simply type your question in the chat and I will pose it to our speaker. While we are waiting for a few questions to arrive, Eleni, can I ask you, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that there were some limits imposed on the number of refugees that they could go to. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that there were some limits imposed by the British on how many refugees could go to the Ionian Islands,
Oh, yes.
and they were fluctuating limits. So what determined
There was not exactly a number in those limits, but they were, they were disapproving of, large refugees populations gathering into the islands because they were afraid of, there was a Russophobia at the time, and they were afraid that the revolution was incited by and helped by the Russians. And they were afraid that the Ionian, the local population would join the revolution, and they were afraid of all those things. And of course, they didn't want to get to very bad terms with the Turks at the time. So they tried to keep a neutrality. Only a neutrality. It was very hard, and a lot of restrictions and severe punishments were, practiced. So much so that even some people brought that to the parliament to be discussed in Britain, the British Parliament, that it was unacceptable to do this and that in Corfu and Zante in particular, and other islands. So it was easier to help after Carnick accepted it was first foreign minister and then as a PM, and he accepted that the Greeks were not rebels but belligerents.
Thank you.
So at the time, things relaxed a little, and so they received more refugees at Calamus Island.
Thank you very much. I believe Nectaria Klapaki has raised
Yes.
Nectaria, if you unmute yourself, we can hear you.
Yes, thank you, Simos. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you, Eleni, for this wonderful talk. It was really fascinating, and I look forward to reading your book when it comes out. So my question is, you mentioned that the Greek women had more legal rights than their other European women at the time. Could you please give us some examples of the legal rights that the Greek women enjoyed at the time and that were absent in Western states?
Well, there were different legal states in different countries, but in general, Greek women had full ownership of their dowry. Their husbands might use it for business purposes, but they couldn't misappropriate it or sold it, or, that's why if bad use of their dowry was made, they could go, the women went to the church because the church judged all those family matters and asked for their dowries to be returned, or they could file for a divorce. They could go to the church to ask for whatever rights they believed they had, if they had been mistreated, if they had been expelled from their household, if they could ask for a divorce for various reasons, even more than they were legally accepted by the Byzantine laws, who were very strict to divorcing people. They could manage their property even as if they inherited, for example, a married woman received her inheritance from her parents or from other sources, she could manage it by herself. This could not be touched by her husband. She had full legal right. That's why some women had private enterprises, because they could manage their own money or they could manage their own inheritance. So I don't know about German. I've read about people discussing about how limited legal rights women had even after the French Revolution. They were not considered citizens anyway. Even after the French Revolution, they were not considered proper citizens. And when it was published, the rights of the citizens, all that, women were not included in that document. So they had the rights that, particularly the women who were married and the widows, they could do as they wished.
Thank you, Eleni. The next question is by Stephen Joyce, who is, so to what extent has the Greek experience at this time as refugees shaped the current attitude Greece has towards the Syrian refugee situation?
Not only Syrian refugees, but all kinds of, from all places, were accepted very, with very friendly intentions here, the first years when this thing started. We never forget that in lots of various periods, quite a lot of Greeks or their ancestors or their families had been the refugees themselves. So refugees were welcomed. But when millions entered Greece, and these were not just refugees, because they were just passing by somehow, people who wanted to go to Germany and other places who did not accept them to work. They were migrants. They were not refugees. That was the problem. That was the great difficulty we had to distinguish between real refugees and people who are not refugees. Even, terrorists tried to pass through Greece. The one who had attacked, had made a very serious attack in Belgium, had passed through Greece at the time with false papers. Others had not papers at all because the refugees tried to have papers. The other ones, those who from Afghanistan who wanted to go to wherever, what they did, either didn't take the papers along or they threw them into the sea. So all the people who still are coming into Greece had no papers to prove from where they are or what their purpose is. So at some point, and that's what happened with the small Aegean islands, with the Greek refugees, people could not support all this big bulk of people entering into Greece. There were not means to support. It was very hard for Lesbos and still is. It was very hard for Chios and still is. And those people, at least most of them, did not want to come here to stay. They wanted to pass through Greece to other countries. Even the refugees. Refugees are given asylum when it is made clear that they are actually refugees and still are. Now, what was the problem before? It was a very long and difficult procedure to make sure who were real refugees and who they were not. And then those who were not, there was supposed to be an agreement with Turkey and the EU that those who are not refugees and they are coming through from Turkey to here, they should be returned back, and Turkey doesn't take them back. So people are stuffed here, and in most cases, in villages and some islands, they are more than the local people. And this is dangerous because if you don't know who they are, actually.
Many more questions on the historical content of the talk. One by Olympiakos Tsoukalis asks, in what ways do the exceptional female figures of Greece, Bouboulina and Manteau, differ from the women of the French Revolution or other revolutions in Europe at the time?
Well, they had the women in Greece at the time were not fighting to overthrow their local notables. Perhaps they didn't like them, but that the revolution was against those who kept them as slaves. There were regions who had some semi-autonomous, which lived under better conditions. But in most cases, people considered themselves slaves. And it was very, even when they had some insurances about certain rights, this was not always the case, because it was up to the masters to change the rules or just disregard them. So it was not something that was, the participation of women was natural, because it was for national reasons, it was for religious reasons, and because they had been, in many places, they had been subjected to such a difficult lives, so many difficult problems. They just wanted to self-govern themselves. It was not, there's a long history discussing whether the reasons of the university of the revolution was social or economical. It has been going on for ages, this thing. But I think the people's main motive was national.
Thank you, Eleni. There is a question by Vanessa Felix, who is asking, with people writing letters to other countries, such as the ladies who wrote to France and England, did other countries eventually step in to assist Greece in their war for independence?
Well, not the countries officially, but there were very strong Philhellenic movements in most places in Europe, in Austria, whose government was very inimical to Metternich was very inimical to all sorts of things, like upheavals and revolutions and all upsets, because everything reminded him the French Revolution. Most Greeks were not against having a kingdom, having been a kingdom as such. Politically, we're not so, at least the mass of people were not revolutionary in the respect quite a lot of European governments thought them to be. This was a misunderstanding of their purposes. They just wanted to be free, and they wanted to exercise their religion freely and to have their own laws and to have some sort of self-government. There are, of course, they wanted to have a better life, and they could not expect to have a better life when they were under a foreign rule at the time. The foreign governments, however, had, they didn't want to upset the Ottoman government at all, because they had very important privileges in the Ottoman Empire, which were not recent. They were going back to the 16th century. They had commercial interests because through Turkey, they traveled to the rest of Asia. It was not necessary for them to go by boat, because at the time they had to go circle all over Africa, and in order to reach the Indian Ocean, it took them ages. It was, the governments disapproved of the revolution. The people started supporting the revolution. And there was such a great Philhellenic movement, and that's what the letters tried to do. That's why a lot of volunteers from Germany, for example, or Austria, from all over Europe, entered into Greece very early on, the first months of the revolution, to help the Greeks. But that was against their government's interest and their will. And they always tried to cut down, in one way or another, people to join the revolution and leave their countries to go there. But eventually, when war went on, and the British and the French interests, even Austrian interests, were harmed by the continuous warfare. And they were still afraid that the Russian might interfere. That was what they were afraid of mostly. They thought it would be better if try to mediate between the belligerents and the Ottoman government. And that was what they tried to do first, to create some sort of mediation. But the Greeks worked on a different schedule, and the foreign governments worked on their own. The letters moved people, and people like the people in the States helped a lot. Particularly, we have very important fighters from the States who came very early on in Greece. But it was a really very great help for the people in when although there was this Monroe decision not to interfere and keep the states neutral, there was a very great American-European Philhellenic, wave, who collected a lot of money, collected a lot to buy food. They sent food, they sent clothes. If you find and read, they're not inaccessible. You can find them in the internet nowadays. The books written by those who brought the American aid into Greece. They make a great story. And we have some of the best descriptions of the bad state the general population lived at the time by those Americans who had come, missionaries and people especially sent to bring in the support. So the letters helped to keep alive the Philhellenic movement. The letters itself did not influence the foreign governments. The people inside England, say, helped by pressing their government. It was not the Greeks that pressed. They didn't care about the Greeks. They preferred neutrality, and they definitely didn't want the Russia to get into the war with the Ottoman Empire. So the main purpose was to keep them apart and keep peace in Europe, not a new war, which all the countries would be involved. And even the great naval battle of Navarino was not well received by the British government at the time. In fact, they tried to somehow not find ways to excuse Codrington, who initiated the naval battle, saying that it was impossible not to interfere because he was attacked and things like that. What they tried to do was create Greece, or part of Greece, a tribute, how to say, a country not fully independent, under the Ottomans, but with local freedom. And after that, they had to pay an enormous amount of money as a tribute to the Ottomans. That's what they were trying to do at the time. That was their main point. Somehow they were obliged of the events, and particularly when Russia, an Ottoman Russia, Turkish National War, Turkish-Russian War started in 1829. After that, they were afraid that the Russians would take great part of Ottoman Empire, will get down and close the Dardanelles. So what they were worrying was about Russia's expansion to the Balkans, actually. I don't know, I've made myself clear. It's very complicated. You have to know lots of things that get into the way.
I think you gave a very full and clear picture, Eleni. There are many comments that are congratulating you on the lecture, stating how excited
Thank you very much. So you're very kind. It's very difficult to find, to say simple things to people who don't know a lot of things about those things, which are complicated as they are. Even when you talk about everyday life, it's complicated for people to understand why women were married when they were 12 years old, for example.
I think you did so admirably, and we all learned a lot. So we have a lot of questions, but I'm going to pose two more so that then everybody can get on with their day.
Oh yes, absolutely. It's already long wear.
Or their night or their evening. So one question by EK, he's signing with his initials or her initials, is, are there any accounts of Turkish women supporting or even freeing Greek women slaves?
Well, not locally, but for example, the wife of the Sultan, the mother of the Sultan of Constantinople, who was interfered to stop the massacre in Chios, but that was something that had harmed her financial affairs very much, because all the tribute paid by Chios went to her coffers. So she had every reason to stop that. So as far as I know, there was not such a thing.
And there is a question by Katerina Daifoti, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correct, which asks, was slavery a common practice in the Ottoman Empire? And did the enslaved Greek women have any impact on the development of the Greek state and society?
What society?
On Greek state and Greek society.
Well, slavery was very common, and it was common very late on in the Ottoman Empire, and in most Muslim states at the time. And those who were enslaved were what the word says, slaves. They had no rights at all, no rights, not even to their lives, nothing. The enslaved women, many of them were not freed, or they did not survive. There were relatively few. There was, I'll add that and I'll stop because it took so long. It was obvious that there was a considerable lack of women and children by the end of the revolution, because Capodicitrius had asked the Austrian negotiator with Procas von Osten, who was the European negotiator between the Greeks and the Egyptians, that in any exchange of prisoners, he preferred to have Greek women and children to be liberated rather than men. That means that there was a demographical problem. It hasn't been taking the attention that needs this fact. But obviously, in order to state officially this demand to have women and children liberated rather than men, that means that quite a lot of women had died or been enslaved. So they needed women for the new state.
And
There was a demographical problem.
And I see another question, which I think it can be a great final question. This is again by Olympia Koutsokalis, who is asking, which female trope, the warrior mother Bouboulina or the virgin charitable patroness Manto, was more accepted among Greeks at the time? And how about Philhellenes? Which one did they more accept?
Oh, the Philhellenes accepted both in the same way. Manto was more appealing because she was more close to the female figures they knew. And the volunteers, the French volunteers made a lot of fuss over her and all this. Bouboulina was popular for other reasons, because she was what we called androgyneka, a woman fighting like a man. She was a very strong figure. She was so very different from all other women well known internationally. So she appealed this way. The appeal Manto had was a different one. And she was in, in rather close contact with lots of French officers and foreigners in Nafplion. So they saw a different kind of the usual Greek woman. Bouboulina was also a different kind of the usual Greek woman.
Thank you very much.
I thank you.
This has been wonderful. So I would like to invite everyone to join me in a virtual round of applause for this wonderful lecture, for this very informative lecture. And I, in my turn, I would like to thank and acknowledge their excellencies, the Ambassador of Greece to the USA, Alexandra Papadopoulou, the Ambassador of Greece to Canada, Konstantina Thanasiadou, the Consul General of Greece in Los Angeles, Evgenia Beniatoglou, the Consul General of Greece in Vancouver, Eleni Georgopoulou, and the Honorary Consul of Cyprus in Los Angeles, Andreas Kyprianidis. I would like to thank our colleagues at the Simon Fraser University and all of you for being here with us today. We look forward to seeing you at our future events.
Myself, I thank everybody, and particularly the ambassador who had the patience and the time to attend the whole lecture. Thank you very much, everybody.